Emily, what's on your radar?
Well, people used to make the mistake of treating media criticism like front-page news when it probably belonged on A2. Most of the time, a story's substance still warranted more attention than the media's treatment of it. But if newspapers still mattered today, media criticism would belong front and center just about every single morning. The daily failures of the legacy media are so severe and so damaging, they now deserve just as much attention as the very news our news media is failing to cover. That is to say, the media is the public's primary window into public affairs. That window is now cracked and fogged to the point where the image is entirely unrecognizable on the other side. Now, yesterday, Mark Lee Greenblatt, Interior Department Inspector General, released a 37-page report on his department's ostensibly exhaustive, independent watchdog investigation into the events of June 1 in Lafayette Square, that historic patch of parkland just north of the White House. And this was last year. Lafayette Square was the scene of a memorable clash between protesters and police on the evening of June 1st, 2020, after which then President Trump walked through the square from the White House to St. John's Church, where he posed with a Bible and said, quote, "We have the greatest country in the world. We're going to keep it nice and safe." The entire legacy media reported that the park was cleared in connection with Trump's photo op, which immediately hardened into a narrative they treated like gospel. Trump deputized police to violently clear peaceful protesters for the sake of a photo op. Take this report from George Stephanopoulos, quote, "The administration asked police to clear peaceful protesters from the park across the White House so that the president could stage a photo op." Now, Glenn Greenwald collected just some of the many, many stories that aged so poorly. Here's an excerpt from his Substack. Quote, "Peaceful protesters tear gas to clear way for Trump church photo op," read the NPR headline on June 1st. The New York Times ran with, quote, "Protesters dispersed with tear gas so Trump could pose at church." CNN devoted multiple segments to venting indignation, while the on-screen graphic declared, quote, "Peaceful protesters near White House tear gassed, shot with rubber bullets so Trump can have photo op." The few journalists who did their jobs correctly, including my boss, Molly Hemingway, were viciously mocked. The dynamic reflects a toxic combination of arrogance and incompetence, and the ratio of arrogance to competence is wildly out of whack. Greenblatt's investigation explicitly disputes the media narrative. He also shows his work, providing pages of evidence based on many interviews to support a more factual rendering of the day. Quote, "The evidence we obtained did not support a finding that the USPP cleared the park to allow the president to survey the damage and walk to St. John's Church. Instead," the report says, quote, "The evidence we reviewed shows that the USPP cleared the park to allow the contractor to safely install the anti-scale fencing in response to destruction of property and injury to officers occurring on May 30th and May 31st. Further, the evidence showed that the USPP did not know about the president's potential movement until mid to late afternoon on June 1st, hours after it had begun developing its operational plan and the fencing contractor had arrived in the park." That's according to the document. Now, I'm not going to treat that as the gospel truth either, but it's obviously credible. So what explains the disconnect then between this watchdog investigation and those initial reports? It shouldn't take a months-long IG probe for the public to get basic facts. Interestingly, in a fact check published last June, Philip Bump of the Washington Post glossed right over the Trump administration's contention that, quote, "somehow Barr's instructions to clear protesters were unrelated to Trump's walk," calling it, quote, "an argument which even Barr didn't directly reject. When he asked Thursday, he claimed that there was an existing plan to extend the secure area around the White House, but didn't deny that the immediate need for doing so was Trump's visit to church." That's from Philip Bump. Now, one administration official not denying something is the thread that Bump staked his narrative on in one of the most prestigious publications in the entire world. Why? Because that thread comported with the hive mind's expectations of Trump, so they all found ways to confirm it. Their ideology is the source of their arrogance, and the arrogance is the source of their incompetence. The media is utterly broken. Now, the IG report contains some important newsworthy findings about what actually went wrong with law enforcement that day. But to my point at the beginning of this segment, its stark contrast with the entire volume of legacy media coverage is equally newsworthy because it's strong evidence the bulk of the public was fed egregiously incorrect information on a major story and for a long time. And the broader implications of that are even worse, exposing the massive cracks in our most important window into public affairs. Campaign platforms typically consist of policy goals. What the press never understood about Donald Trump is that he basically ran on media criticism, and sadly a whole lot of it was entirely fair. That's why it resonated. But even after the host of Celebrity Apprentice defeated the former Secretary of State in a presidential matchup, the media's necessary course correction never materialized. Things have clearly gotten much, much worse. They peddled the false, self-serving narratives of spies and flaks for years, miring the country in a silly melodrama over a P-tape. Then there's the lab leak flip-flop. How about the press's treatments of Andrew Cuomo last spring? It doesn't just happen on these major stories either. We could talk about the hypocrisy of the press. We could talk about their intolerance for ideological diversity. We could talk about their elitism or their obsessions with Twitter. These are all variables in the equation of their failure. But the most important takeaway is that the media peddles glaring disinformation on a daily basis on major stories. That's a big deal because it's misinforming voters and much more effectively than those scary boomer memes Putin put on Facebook. Democracy dies in darkness, sure, but bumbling Harvard grads with press credentials can turn the light switch off with their incompetence just as much as corrupt rulers can do it with their power and their money. We desperately need the free press. It's our only way to keep the government accountable, and it's a disaster right now. So there's your front page. Okay, Ryan, this is obviously something that happens on a daily basis. The media gets stories wrong. Now, that would happen even with a healthy media, right? It's okay to make mistakes. It's impossible. You know, the famous first draft of history line gets used a lot, but it's impossible for every report that comes out to be accurate. I think what we see, however, is a daily pattern now of major mistakes. And as somebody on the right who's always been frustrated by the media, as I'm sure you have, I mean, this goes back to, on the left, at least Chomsky, if not earlier than that, it's always was tempting before to treat the media's failure or a bad media criticism like it was the real story, right? Like you can get mixed up with that when the real story itself was usually more important than the media's failure to cover it. And now I think they're both just as important because the media coverage has been so damaging to the country. And on some of these big stories, it really is a very big deal. I don't know.
Yeah, I do think that the media did blow it a lot on Trump. I start with that. On this one in particular, I haven't read the IG report yet. So is his basic claim that it was just a huge coincidence that they cleared the park and then he walked across it to the church?
No, his claim is that this was a process that was totally in motion for hours, and
right,
it had to do with
the fencing. He just happened to be, and then Trump just happened to walk right after that.
Well, no, as it was like ongoing, basically that like, so the protesters were congealing, then Trump was going to walk through, and so the park was going to be cleared sort of regardless of whether or not Trump actually walked through, and the orders had been given before people actually knew that Trump was going to do that.
I mean, it's great that everything's going to come out. I'm not actually certain that it would have changed the narrative too much, because Trump still made the decision, you know, and remember why he made the decision. It was because Maggie Haberman had reported that he was down in a bunker in the White House the day before.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Which incredible reporting. Who around Trump is leaking that? Because that's the kind of detail that you find out in a year or two after a president leaves in some book. Instead, that night, he's still in the bunker.
Right.
And he's seeing on television that he's in the bunker. And he's humiliated by that.
Right.
And so he makes the decision, I'm going to show that I'm a tough guy.
Right.
I'm going to walk, maybe Ivanka had the idea originally or something, but he's going to leave his bunker and he's going to leave these gates and he's going to go across the park, which is currently occupied by protesters, and he's going to wave a Bible around in front of the church.
It was a very Trumpian move.
So he's
a very Trumpian move.
So he's going to do all this. When he made the decision, the park was filled with protesters. The park is cleared of protesters. He walks through it. If the IG is saying that this was a parallel process, that was ordered by Barr so that they could put up fencing, and they happened to coincidentally have come up with this idea of walking through the church. I'm willing to accept evidence that that's the case. I do think the public would still say the security forces, which report ultimately to the president, violently cleared these peaceful demonstrators with tear gas, and then they deny that, or with chemical weapons or whatever. They denied that, but now there's evidence that they did in fact use it. Yeah,
that's actually one of the most interesting and I think really legitimately newsy things in this IG report. And by the way, I thought that Trump photo op was terrible at the time, and I still do today. But that IG report found that and if you read it, it's really interesting actually exactly to see the process of failure. And it admits to the failures of the various law enforcement groups that were tasked with, maintaining order in that sort of area just north of the White House. And I think that's, again, it's really interesting because it's all these different failures to communicate and sort of how all of this stuff got just flubbed in the bureaucracy of communicating between different law enforcement agencies. And the use of chemical irritants was one of those. That's actually one of the things implicated in this kind of bureaucratic nightmare.
Right, where people said no, they were used, and they said no, we didn't use them, and now their IG said, well, actually they were right. Like they did actually use some of those. And so there's some element of lying, there's some element of just confusion and bureaucratic incompetence. But yeah, I mean, the president was standing there and had agency, saw what was happening, and decided, you know what, the move for me right now is to march across this. He could see the chaos as it was unfolding. He knew what was going on. He may not personally have ordered it to be cleared. He still made that decision to walk across there and wave that thing. And a lot of it's a giant who cares. It's because this is all optics. But at the same time, this is what he claims to be his strength, understanding the public mood and manipulating the public mood and showing, that he's the leader, he's the tough one, he's got this under control. He lectured all the governors around the state, you got to be tough, you got to smash them. You guys are weak, you're going to get run over. So he put his own shtick into practice, and it blew up in his face. And maybe he had some bad luck because they were clearing this. But if they hadn't cleared it, he wouldn't have done it.
Well, I think, yeah, absolutely. But I think there's an important distinction there. And the headlines that I read from Glenn's Substack, I think are really important because the way this is framed, even the George Stephanopoulos quote, is that Trump ordered it all to happen this way so that he could do this photo op. Like this happened.
Right. And that's where the media goes overboard. If you don't know that for sure, you can't report that.
And that's a big deal in my opinion. That's a big deal because that's sort of the difference between like a bumbling president and an actual like fascist.
And the media has ways of conveying information in a way that does not cross a line into a lie. You do it. I mean, you can workshop the headline with your copy editors, but it goes something like, as Park police, violently clear Park. You don't want Park twice in there. So as police violently clear Park.
This is a little, this is how like, the sausage gets made here.
Comma, Trump visits church for photo op. You put the two things next to each other because they are relevant. It's not a lie to put them next to each other. But if you don't know that Trump gave the order, and you don't have sources that are telling you that Trump gave the order,
other than Barr not saying that,
then you can't just say that.
But that's why I think this is such an instructive case study, because the narrative was so strong and turned out to be so wrong, right? So like it's not as though these things are entirely unconnected, I'm sure, right? Like Trump couldn't have gotten through that park. He wouldn't have personally been sort of like spearing protesters as he like walked through Lafayette Square. Yeah, right. No, that's not what would have happened. But this is the media's job. And if you're just, reading the news as a voter and you see that Trump literally ordered this park cleared with chemical irritants to clear a path for himself to do this dumb photo op, that is a huge difference. And the media's lack of restraint and lack of competence in actually reporting this stuff out, I think it's incredible, especially as we're sort of like right now reckoning with the death of their clinging to the narrative about the lab leak being a conspiracy theory. And not only were they wrong, they viciously mocked the people who had a different report.
Right.
Like anybody who reported something different was a Trumpy moron. And that is how you get this like totally chilled atmosphere. But then again, it's why shows like this do really well, because people know more and more that they can't trust everything that they're hearing, if not anything that they're hearing, from the legacy media. So I guess again, if we're finding the silver lining on this Thursday, there's some more silver lining for you.
There you go.
Looking forward to seeing what's on your radar next, Ryan.
You got it.